Good evening. I'm here to gently guide you on a journey back through history to a time of ancient cities and legendary figures. As you settle in comfortably, let your mind drift softly to the distant past. Tonight, we'll explore the story of Hannibal Barca, a famous general from the city of Carthage who lived over 2,000 years ago. We'll follow his rise to greatness and his eventual fall, all at a slow and peaceful pace. This won't be a loud or intense tale, even though it involves wars and battles. I'll describe everything calmly and gently, so you can relax and listen without any worry. Think of it as a bedtime story set in ancient times, informative, but also soothing. You don't need to remember every detail, just let the words wash over you and lull you towards sleep. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the setting of our story. Picture a warm Mediterranean night sky full of stars. Below, the city of Carthage rests by the sea, its harbor quiet after sunset. Far across the water lies another great city, Rome, under the same stars. These two cities were once rivals, and between them, moving quietly through the pages of history, is Hannibal, the hero of our story. I'll start at the very beginning, giving you all the context you need. Hannibal's journey spans years of struggle and adventure, but I'll make sure to repeat and reinforce the important points softly as we go. That way, even if you drift off for a bit, you'll be able to rejoin the narrative smoothly when you awaken or listen again. So feel free to get cozy, snuggle into your pillow, take slow, deep breaths, and let your body relax. There's nothing else you need to do right now but listen to the gentle story of Hannibal's life. Let's begin, then, with Hannibal's early years. Imagine the scene: a little boy in Carthage, long ago, unaware of the destiny that awaits him. Our calm journey through the rise and fall of Hannibal Barca starts here, and I'll be with you every step of the way, softly narrating. Now, let's step into the past, into the soft glow of history, and meet young Hannibal. Many years before Hannibal became a general, he was a young boy growing up in Carthage. Carthage was a powerful city-state located in what is now Tunisia in North Africa. It was a city of merchants and sailors, its harbors filled with ships that sailed across the Mediterranean Sea. Hannibal was born there, into a family that was both prominent and passionate. His father was Hamilcar Barca, a renowned Carthaginian general. The name Barca meant thunderbolt, a sign of the fiery energy that ran in the family. Before Hannibal was born, Carthage had fought a long war against Rome. That war, later known as the First Punic War, ended with Carthage's defeat. Carthage lost important territories and had to pay a heavy tribute to Rome. The defeat was painful for proud men like Hamilcar Barca. Hannibal grew up hearing about this conflict. Even as a child, he could sense the bitter feelings Carthaginians had toward Rome. It was in this climate of quiet resentment and hope for renewal that Hannibal spent his early years. Hannibal was said to be a lively and intelligent child, with bright eyes and an eager spirit. He loved to listen to his father's stories of battles and distant lands. Hamilcar saw promise in his son. When Hannibal was around 9 years old, Hamilcar prepared to leave Carthage to lead an expedition to Spain. Carthage was expanding its influence in the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, to rebuild strength and wealth. Young Hannibal begged his father to take him along on the campaign. He didn't want to be left behind. At first, Hamilcar was hesitant. The journey and the life of a military camp were harsh, especially for a young boy. But Hannibal was determined and persistent. Seeing his son's resolve, Hamilcar decided to bring him to Spain. However, before they departed, Hamilcar wanted to instill in Hannibal a guiding purpose. According to ancient historians, Hamilcar brought Hannibal to a sacred altar. In the flickering light of a sacrifice, with the smoke of offerings curling into the sky, the father had the son place his tiny hand on the altar. In a solemn moment, Hamilcar asked Hannibal to swear an oath. Hannibal listened as his father spoke softly yet firmly. Hamilcar asked him to swear that he would never be a friend to Rome. This meant that for all his life, Hannibal should consider Rome an enemy and do everything he could to oppose it. To a 9-year-old boy, these words were serious, but Hannibal reportedly took the vow eagerly. He idolized his father and shared his father's feelings about Rome. even if he was too young to fully understand them. Hannibal promised, with all the earnestness of a child, that he would hate Rome forever. It was a promise that would shape his destiny. After this profound moment, Hannibal set out with his father to Spain. Imagine the young boy aboard a ship crossing the sea, leaving behind his home city. The journey would have been long, but Hannibal had the comfort of being by his father's side. In Spain, Hamilcar began carving out a new empire for Carthage. The land was rich in resources like silver, and Hamilcar planned to use these to strengthen Carthage and perhaps one day challenge Rome again. In Spain, Hannibal grew up amidst soldiers and camps, learning the art of war from a very young age. There were probably early mornings where he would wake up to the sound of trumpets in the camp, and evenings where he fell asleep by the glow of campfires, listening to seasoned soldiers tell stories of battles. As he grew into his teenage years, Hannibal learned to ride horses, to fight with sword and spear, and, importantly, to think like a military leader. He observed his father negotiating with local tribes and leading troops in the field. All these experiences were shaping Hannibal into the person he would become. Life in the army camp could be harsh. The young Hannibal likely traveled over rugged lands in Spain, through forests and over hills, as his father's forces subdued various Iberian tribes. But Spain was also a place of learning for him. Away from Carthage, in a foreign land, Hannibal became adaptable and tough. He learned the languages of the soldiers, who came from different regions, and he learned to inspire trust and loyalty in those around him. Hannibal's education was not in a classroom with books, but out on the field with real-life lessons in leadership and strategy. When Hannibal was a teenager, he experienced a great loss. His father, Hamilcar, died unexpectedly. One story says that Hamilcar drowned while crossing a river during a battle, though details are a bit hazy due to the ancient sources. For Hannibal, who was very close to his father, this was a deeply sad moment. Hamilcar had been not only a parent, but also Hannibal's mentor and hero. Hannibal was left in a foreign land without his guiding figure. But he was not alone. The command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain passed to Hamilcar's son-in-law, a man named Hasdrubal, known as Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal was an experienced leader and continued Hamilcar's work of expanding Carthaginian power in Spain. Hannibal remained with the army and served under Hasdrubal's command. Even as a young man, Hannibal stood out. He was brave, and he showed a natural talent for tactics and leading soldiers. The troops saw in him the spirit of his father. Over the years, Hannibal earned their respect by taking part in campaigns and possibly leading smaller units on his own. One can imagine him, now in his early 20s, confidently riding at the head of a column of Carthaginian soldiers or negotiating with local tribal chiefs on behalf of Hasdrubal. Each year he grew more skilled and more respected. During this time, Hannibal's family, in a broader sense, was around too. He had younger brothers, named Hasdrubal, a different Hasdrubal, sharing the same name as the brother-in-law and Mago. They had also come to Spain, and the Barcid family, as they were known after that Barca nickname, became central figures in Carthage's Spanish territories. Hasdrubal the Fair, the commander-in-chief in Spain, was not only Hannibal's superior, but also part of his family by marriage. Under Hasdrubal's leadership, Carthaginian Spain prospered. He founded a new capital city called New Carthage, Latin, Carthago Nova, in what is now Cartagena in modern Spain. Hannibal spent his young adulthood in this vibrant city by the sea, which became a base of operations for Carthaginian power in Iberia. In the year 221 BC, another turning point came in Hannibal's life. Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated. The details differ in accounts, but one story is that a local servant or enemy took Hasdrubal's life. His sudden death left a leadership void in Spain. The Carthaginian soldiers, who had fought under Hamilcar and then Hasdrubal, needed a new commander. They turned to Hannibal. Despite being only 26 years old, Hannibal had already proven himself to the army. The troops admired his courage, his tactical mind, and his ability to lead. They also felt a connection to him through his father's legacy. So, in the wake of Hasdrubal's death, the army proclaimed Hannibal as their commander-in-chief. It was a remarkable show of confidence in someone so young. When word was sent back to Carthage, the government there officially approved Hannibal's command. Now, Hannibal Barca stood at the head of Carthage's military forces in Iberia, ready to fulfill what many believed was his destiny. Imagine Hannibal at this moment, a young general standing perhaps on a hill overlooking his camp, the same land where he had followed his father years ago. The sun might be setting, casting a golden glow on the landscape of Spain, as Hannibal contemplated the immense responsibility now on his shoulders. He likely felt a mixture of sorrow missing his father and brother-in-law who were gone, pride, and determination. He had sworn an oath as a child to be Rome's enemy, and now he was in a position to truly make a difference and perhaps challenge Rome's power. Hannibal's mind would now turn toward the future and the fulfillment of that long-standing grudge between Carthage and Rome. He was young, energetic, and driven by a lifelong purpose. Under his leadership, the stage was set for a new conflict that would become one of the most famous wars in ancient history, the Second Punic War. But before plunging into war, Hannibal spent some time securing his position and planning his next moves. Though still so relatively young, Hannibal proved to be a capable administrator and strategist in the years just after taking command. He married a local Iberian princess named Emils, forging a bond with the native population. It shows that Hannibal was not only a warrior but could also be diplomatic, creating alliances and goodwill among the people of Spain. The marriage might have also brought Hannibal some personal happiness and a sense of home in Iberia. With Emils, he even had a son, though the records of what became of his wife and child are lost to history, and they lived their lives mostly out of the limelight that shone on Hannibal's military exploits. For 2 years after assuming command, Hannibal campaigned in the Iberian Peninsula to consolidate Carthaginian control. He led successful expeditions against local tribes, expanding Carthage's territory and securing resources. Each victory further unified his army and the Carthaginian hold on Spain. The soldiers grew to love Hannibal, seeing that he shared their hardships and could also share the rewards of victory with them. Hannibal was known for his ability to understand both his own army and his enemies, an ability that would serve him well in the coming war. By 219 BC, Hannibal felt confident and ready to challenge the power of Rome more directly. Relations between Carthage, especially its Spanish domain, and Rome had been tense for years, but now the tension was about to snap. A specific incident would provide the spark for the war that Hannibal and perhaps his late father had long anticipated. That spark was a conflict over a town called Saguntum. Saguntum was a wealthy city in eastern Spain. It lay just south of a river called the Ebro, which at that time served as a sort of agreed boundary between Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence in Spain. Rome had an understanding with Carthage, from an earlier treaty, that Carthage would not expand north of the Ebro River. Saguntum, though south of that river, had an alliance or friendship with Rome. This made the situation complicated. Carthage might have considered Saguntum as fair game for expansion, while Rome considered it under their protection. Hannibal saw Saguntum as an opportunity. From his perspective and likely that of the Carthaginians, Saguntum was meddling in Carthaginian territory under Rome's encouragement. If Carthage was to solidify control of Spain and challenge Rome, Saguntum could not be ignored. So Hannibal decided to lay siege to the city, and so, in 219 BC, Hannibal Barca led his forces to the walls of Saguntum. The siege that followed would be the fuse that ignited a second great war between Carthage and Rome. As we transition to this next phase of the story, keep in mind the young boy who had sworn hatred to Rome and imagine how he must have felt now, commanding an army and attacking a city allied with Rome. Hannibal was taking bold steps, and the world around him was about to erupt into conflict once more, with him at the center of the storm. By the end of the siege of Saguntum in 219 BC, Hannibal had achieved a significant victory, but one that would spark a far greater conflict. The siege lasted about 8 long months. It was a tough fight. The Saguntines, allied with Rome, defended their city bravely. Hannibal himself was wounded during the siege, though he recovered. Finally, Saguntum fell to the Carthaginian army. Hannibal treated the conquered city as a treasure trove to support his war efforts. He sent much of the captured wealth back to Carthage, which helped win political support for what was to come. In Carthage, most leaders rallied behind Hannibal, proud of the victory. Only a few voices cautioned against angering Rome further. When Rome learned of Saguntum's fall, the Roman Senate was furious. They sent envoys to Carthage, demanding justice and the surrender of Hannibal to Rome. It is said that one of the Roman envoys, upon meeting the Carthaginian council, dramatically gathered a fold of his toga and declared, "Here, we bring you peace or war. Choose which you will have." The Carthaginian council members replied that Rome could choose. The envoy then said he gave them war. Whether or not these exact words were spoken, the message was clear. Rome and Carthage were at war again. This marked the beginning of the Second Punic War in 218 BC. Hannibal was prepared for this outcome. In fact, he had initiated the conflict knowing it would lead to war. He had a daring plan that no one on the Roman side expected. Instead of waiting for the Romans to bring the fight to Spain or Africa, Hannibal decided to take the war directly to Rome's doorstep. His plan was to march his army from Spain, through Gaul, the region roughly corresponding to modern France, over the towering Alps, and descend into Italy. This was an immensely bold strategy. At that time, the Alps were seen as a nearly impassable barrier, especially with a large army and war elephants. Very few would have imagined that an army could traverse those snow-capped mountains, but Hannibal aimed to do just that. Before setting out, Hannibal made careful arrangements. He left a sizable force behind in Spain under the command of his younger brother, Hasdrubal, not to be confused with Hasdrubal the Fair, who had died. This was to protect Carthaginian territory and keep a supply line. He also dispatched some troops to guard Carthage and North Africa, ensuring that if the Romans tried to attack Carthage while he was away, his homeland would not be defenseless. Once these preparations were complete, Hannibal gathered his strike force for the march to Italy. It was late spring or early summer of 218 BC when Hannibal's army began its epic journey. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of soldiers marching out of New Carthage in Spain, heading northwards. The army was a diverse mix. There were hardened African infantry from Carthage and its territories, skilled Iberian warriors from Spain, nimble Numidian cavalry famous for riding without saddles and throwing javelins, and even a number of war elephants lumbering along. These elephants were an exotic and formidable part of the army, intended to frighten enemies and break their lines. Hannibal likely had around 50,000 soldiers and perhaps a few dozen elephants when he started north. It was a grand and determined host, following a young general on an unprecedented mission. As Hannibal advanced, he had to navigate both geography and diplomacy. The path first led through the Iberian lands where some tribes were not yet under Carthaginian control. Hannibal had to fight or negotiate his way through various tribal territories. Some confrontations occurred and some tribes resisted, but others, impressed or influenced by Hannibal, allowed his passage or even joined him. Each challenge was met with Hannibal's characteristic mix of bravery and cunning. His army crossed the Ebro River, which marked the northern limit of Carthaginian expansion as agreed with Rome, thus officially moving into territory Rome considered under its influence. After pushing through the rugged terrain of what is now Catalonia and the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and Gaul, Hannibal entered Gaul, modern France. Here, too, he encountered both friends and foes among the local Gallic tribes. It was now late summer. To keep morale and ensure speed, Hannibal left behind some troops to garrison key points and also allowed some reluctant or exhausted soldiers to return home. By the time he reached the banks of the Rhone River in southern Gaul, his forces had somewhat decreased in number due to these strategic detachments and earlier skirmishes. Crossing the broad Rhone River was the next major hurdle. On the far side of the river, some Gallic tribes, allied with Rome or hostile to any invader, gathered to oppose Hannibal's crossing. In a clever move, Hannibal sent a detachment of his men quietly upriver during the night. This flanking force crossed at a quieter spot and came around behind the Gallic warriors. At dawn, as Hannibal's main force began to cross the Rhone using hastily constructed rafts and boats, even floating some of his elephants on large rafts covered with earth to resemble solid ground. The hidden detachment attacked the Gauls from the rear. Caught by surprise, the Gallic defenders scattered, and Hannibal's army successfully made it to the eastern bank of the river. Now Hannibal was in the land that is just north of the Alps. Here he resupplied and met with local allies, including the Boii and other Celtic tribes of northern Italy who had been chafing under Roman expansion. These allies provided guidance about the routes through the Alpine passes. The season was advancing. It was now late autumn. Snow would soon blanket the high mountains. Hannibal knew he had to cross before winter fully set in. The march into the Alps is one of the most legendary episodes of Hannibal's story. Picture the long column of soldiers winding its way upward into steep, narrow mountain trails. The weather grew colder as they ascended. Men and animals alike struggled for footing on rocky paths that sometimes edged along cliffs with terrifying drops below. The higher they went, the thinner the air became, making each step more laborious. Snow began to appear on the ground, and icy winds blew. Many of the soldiers from Africa or Spain had never experienced such cold. At times, Hannibal's army was harassed by mountain tribes who rolled boulders or launched attacks from heights. Hannibal had to be alert and strategic, even in this perilous ascent, arranging his march to ward off ambushes. There are dramatic tales from later historians about the challenges they faced: landslides blocking paths, or one story of Hannibal using vinegar and fire to break apart rocks that blocked the way, though this particular tale might be more legend than fact. What we can be sure of is that the crossing was grueling and losses were heavy. Step by step, day by day, the Carthaginian army made its way through the Alps. Hannibal himself was at the front at times, encouraging his troops, or at the back, making sure no stragglers were left behind to be picked off by the cold or the enemy. He shared in the hardships, which must have strengthened the soldiers' devotion to him. After roughly 2 weeks, some accounts say 17 days, Hannibal's army finally emerged on the Italian side of the Alps. The descent into Italy was a relief in some ways. They had passed the highest points and saw milder lands ahead. However, the toll was severe. According to records, out of the tens of thousands who began the climb, only about 26,000 soldiers remained, and a few surviving elephants. Many had perished or deserted along the way. It was late 218 BC, and a weary but determined Hannibal now stood in the plains of northern Italy, the region of the Po Valley. He had accomplished the impossible, bringing a foreign army over the Alps into Roman territory. This feat alone shocked the Romans, who had not anticipated that Hannibal would even attempt such a journey. In Rome, the news of Hannibal's approach caused alarm. The Romans had expected to face Hannibal in Spain or maybe North Africa, not in Italy itself, coming from the north. The Roman legions that had been sent toward Spain under the command of Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul for that year, quickly had to adjust. Scipio had reached southern Gaul by sea, only to hear that Hannibal had already moved inland. He hurried back to Italy by ship, racing to confront the unexpected threat. The first clash between Hannibal and the Romans on Italian soil happened near the Ticino River, a tributary of the Po. Scipio the consul led a cavalry force to probe Hannibal's position. Hannibal, with his superior Numidian cavalry and other mounted troops, engaged them. In this brisk cavalry skirmish, the Romans were defeated and Scipio himself was wounded. The young son of Scipio, who later would be known as Scipio Africanus, reportedly saved his father's life in this battle by charging into the fray to rescue him. The Romans retreated, and Hannibal gained an early minor victory in Italy. It was a sign of things to come, as Hannibal was proving his aggressive strategy would put Rome on the defensive. After the engagement at the Ticino, Hannibal moved to confront the Romans in a more substantial battle. The Roman Senate had another army in the north under the other consul, Sempronius Longus. By December of 218 BC, Hannibal managed to lure Sempronius into a battle on the banks of the Trebia River. The morning of the battle was bitterly cold. Hannibal used a clever tactic to weaken the Roman soldiers even before the fight began. He sent a small force of cavalry across the river to harass the Roman camp and then feign retreat. The hot-headed Sempronius ordered his legions to pursue immediately. The Roman soldiers, not having eaten breakfast and rushing to battle, waded through the freezing Trebia River in pursuit of Hannibal's troops. It was midwinter, and the icy water chilled the Romans to the bone. By the time they reached the opposite bank, they were shivering and disorganized. On the far side, Hannibal had arranged his army ready for them. He hid a contingent of troops, led by his brother Mago, in the tall vegetation along the river bank earlier that night. Now, as the wet and cold Roman soldiers engaged Hannibal's main forces, Mago's hidden troops sprang from ambush, attacking the Romans from an unexpected direction. Hannibal's cavalry, especially the Numidians, also outflanked the Roman cavalry and infantry. The result was chaos for the Roman army. The Carthaginians attacked fiercely, and the Romans, already in poor condition from cold and hunger, started to break apart. Despite being outnumbered initially, Hannibal's tactics won the day. Many Roman soldiers were cut down on the battlefield, while others tried to flee back across the river. Some managed to escape. Perhaps around 10,000 Romans fought their way out and lived to fight another day, but they had to slip away in defeat. The rest of the Roman force was largely destroyed or captured. Hannibal's victory at the Trebia River was complete. This was a major battle, and its outcome sent a chill through Rome beyond the literal chill the soldiers felt. Never before had Rome suffered such a defeat on their own soil by an invader from abroad at this scale. It was a clear demonstration of Hannibal's cunning and the discipline and courage of his multinational army. After Trebia, much of northern Italy, especially the Gallic tribes in the Po Valley, openly declared support for Hannibal. They had long disliked Roman rule and now saw Hannibal as a liberator. His army took some time to rest and recuperate during the remainder of the winter in the friendly territory of the Gauls, who provided supplies and new recruits to replenish Hannibal's ranks. When the spring of 217 BC arrived, Hannibal resumed his campaign, marching southward into the heart of Italy. By now, Rome had raised new forces and was determined to stop him. One Roman consul, Gaius Flaminius, took command of an army and positioned himself to block Hannibal's advance toward central Italy. Flaminius was eager to confront Hannibal, perhaps too eager. Hannibal, with his usual strategic foresight, looked for ways to outmaneuver the Roman army. To do so, Hannibal executed a daring march around Flaminius's position. To the amazement of those following his campaign, Hannibal led his troops through the marshes and swamps along the Arno River. This route was treacherous and unexpected. It allowed him to bypass Flaminius's fortified positions. The march through the marshes was grueling. The soldiers trudged for days in water and mud, under constant rain and without proper rest. Hannibal himself, according to legend, suffered from an eye infection during this march, eventually losing sight in one of his eyes. Yet, despite these difficulties, he succeeded in flanking the Roman army. Emerging from the marshes, Hannibal had effectively gotten behind Flaminius, threatening the city of Rome's hinterlands and drawing Flaminius out. The Roman consul hurried after Hannibal, determined not to let the Carthaginians ravage the region unopposed. Hannibal realized that Flaminius was aggressive and not exercising caution, so he set a perfect trap for him by the shores of Lake Trasimene in central Italy. Lake Trasimene is surrounded by hills on one side. Hannibal carefully picked a spot along a narrow road that ran between the lake's edge and the adjacent hills. At dawn on a misty morning in June 217 BC, Hannibal hid most of his army in the wooded hills overlooking that road. He left a smaller contingent visible closer to the lake as bait. Flaminius's force marched along the road, with the lake on one side and hills on the other, not realizing what lay in wait. With the heavy morning fog rising from the lake, visibility was poor. When the majority of the Roman column had entered the narrow trap, Hannibal gave a signal. Trumpets sounded, and suddenly the stillness of the morning was shattered. Carthaginian troops rushed down from hiding spots on the hills and fell upon the Roman column from the flank and rear. The ambush was devastatingly effective. Caught by surprise, the Roman soldiers could not form their ranks properly. Panic set in as the Carthaginians attacked fiercely from higher ground, and the front line was blocked by Hannibal's troops that had been serving as bait. Many Roman soldiers were pushed toward the lake in the chaos. Some tried to escape into the water, while others were cut down before they could even react. The battle, if one can call it a battle since it was essentially a one-sided massacre, was over in a short time, perhaps in under 2 or 3 hours. The Roman army of Flaminius was virtually annihilated. Flaminius himself was slain in the fighting, unable to rally his men against the sudden onslaught. When the fog lifted later in the day, the scale of Hannibal's success became clear. Lake Trasimene's waters, it's said, ran red with Roman blood. Several thousand Romans died, and thousands more were captured. It was one of the largest and most successful ambushes in military history. Importantly, Hannibal's strategy of taking the fight to Italy and using guile and surprise continued to pay off spectacularly. He had now destroyed 2 Roman armies at Trebia and Trasimene and severely shaken Rome's confidence. However, in keeping with our gentle telling of this tale rather than focusing on the gore, we can reflect on the outcome calmly. In the aftermath of Trasimene, the Roman Republic was in shock and mourning. Yet, even in this dark hour, the Romans did not consider giving up. The immediate result was that Rome decided on a change of strategy and leadership. They appointed a temporary dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus, a seasoned statesman and general, to handle the emergency. Fabius was given extraordinary powers to deal with Hannibal. His approach would be very different from his predecessors, as we shall see. As Hannibal's army moved further into Italy, victorious but also aware that more Roman legions would come, Hannibal allowed his men to rest and recover when possible. He treated prisoners with a relatively humane policy, releasing allied Italian captives, for example, to encourage goodwill among Rome's subject peoples. His aim was not just to defeat the Roman armies but also to win over Rome's allies in Italy, convincing them to join his cause against Rome. Some towns and allies indeed began to waver in their loyalty to Rome, seeing that Rome could not thus far protect them from this invader. Hannibal's reputation as an invincible general grew with each encounter. Up to now, the young boy from Carthage who swore an oath had made good on his promise in the grandest way. Hannibal was deep in Italy, undefeated, and carrying victory after victory. The stage was set for a different kind of response from the Romans under Fabius Maximus. The war would continue, but now in a slower, more cautious manner as Rome tried to find a way to handle this formidable opponent. We will continue to explore how Hannibal's campaign unfolds, with Rome adapting and Hannibal countering, in a patient struggle of wits and will. After the disaster at Lake Trasimene, Rome realized they needed a new approach. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a temporary position giving him near absolute authority to deal with the emergency. Fabius was an older, wise statesman known for being careful and patient. He studied Hannibal's tactics and decided that the best way to protect Rome was to avoid direct battles with this cunning adversary. This approach was cautious and differed from the aggressive tactics that had led to such costly Roman defeats. Instead of immediately seeking a big battle, Fabius shadowed Hannibal's army from a distance. He followed the Carthaginians along the Italian countryside, staying always on higher ground or in secure positions, but never closing for a full fight. His strategy was to wear Hannibal down indirectly, by denying him the chance to win another decisive victory, by cutting off his supply lines when possible, and by constantly keeping him on the move. If Hannibal's troops could not find rest or enough food, perhaps their strength would diminish over time. Hannibal quickly noticed this change in Roman tactics. He began leading his army through the fertile parts of Italy, burning crops and villages, trying to bait Fabius into attacking. Yet Fabius remained resolute and did not fall into the trap. This earned Fabius the nickname Cunctator, which means the delayer in Latin. Some in Rome admired his prudence, but many others grew frustrated, feeling that Rome was yielding the countryside to Hannibal without a fight. It was hard for the proud Romans to watch Hannibal's army roam seemingly at will, destroying farms and taking supplies. One particular episode showcased both Hannibal's ingenuity and Fabius's caution. While in the region of Campania south of Rome, Hannibal maneuvered into an area with terrain that suddenly left him somewhat boxed in, a valley surrounded by hills, with only a narrow pass for escape. Fabius saw an opportunity. He moved his forces to block the exit, effectively trapping Hannibal in the valley. Roman soldiers held the high ground and the pass, and it seemed they had finally cornered the Carthaginian army. Hannibal, however, was not so easily trapped. In the dark of night, he devised a clever escape plan, almost like something from a quiet, suspenseful tale. He gathered a large herd of oxen from the local farms. To each ox, his soldiers attached bundles of dry reeds and branches to their horns. When everything was prepared, Hannibal ordered the bundles lit on fire. As the flames flared up, the oxen, frightened by the fire on their own heads, were released and driven up the slopes of the hills above the valley. From a distance in the darkness, these moving lights, hundreds of them, looked just like an army silently marching by torchlight. The Roman troops guarding the hilltops and the exits saw this long line of flickering lights climbing the hills and believed, in confusion, that it was Hannibal's men attempting a desperate breakout over the mountains at night. They rushed to intercept what they thought was the Carthaginian army. In the chaos, the oxen with flaming horns scattered through the hills, some eventually collapsing as the fires burned out. Meanwhile, with the Roman troops drawn off to chase the decoys, the real Hannibal quietly led his army through the now lightly guarded pass and slipped away into the darkness. By the time the Romans realized they had been tricked by a herd of cattle, Hannibal was gone, once again roaming free in the Italian countryside. This incident enhanced both Hannibal's legend for cunning and, ironically, Fabius's growing unpopularity in Rome. Even though Fabius had a plan to grind Hannibal down slowly, many Romans saw only that Hannibal was escaping traps and continuing to pillage at will. They wanted a more aggressive approach. Political pressure mounted in Rome against Fabius's cautious strategy. As a compromise, the Roman Senate decided to alter Fabius's command structure. They appointed Fabius's master of horse, essentially his second in command, a man named Minucius Rufus, as co-commander with equal authority. This was unusual because it effectively meant Rome had two leaders at once with potentially different strategies. Minucius, unlike Fabius, believed that Hannibal could and should be beaten in open battle sooner rather than later. Given an independent command of part of the army, Minucius seized the chance to prove himself. He engaged in a skirmish with Carthaginian forces that he believed was a great success, though Hannibal likely only let him have a small win to boost his confidence. Buoyed by this, Minucius grew even more eager to bring Hannibal to battle. He got that opportunity not long after, when Hannibal set another trap for the impetuous Roman. Hannibal deployed a small detachment on a hill visible to the Roman camp, as if they were an isolated unit ripe for attack. Minucius took the bait and advanced quickly with his half of the army to attack those Carthaginians. But Hannibal had once again prepared an ambush. He had concealed troops among the nearby hills and, at the right moment, these forces emerged and attacked Minucius's army on the flanks, threatening to surround them. It was a smaller-scale echo of what happened at Trasimene, and suddenly Minucius's forces were in great peril, being roughly handled by Hannibal's men. Fabius, camped not far off with the other half of the Roman army, realized what was happening. Despite their earlier differences, he swiftly moved his legions to aid Minucius. Arriving in time, Fabius managed to stabilize the situation and rescue Minucius's embattled troops. Hannibal, not wanting a full battle with Fabius as well, chose not to press further and withdrew. Minucius's rash offensive had nearly led to another Roman disaster, if not for Fabius's timely intervention. This close call taught Minucius a humbling lesson. In a gracious and respectful gesture, Minucius relinquished his equal authority and returned command back to Fabius alone, reportedly even addressing Fabius as father, acknowledging that the older general's strategy and wisdom had saved him. The Roman army once again unified under Fabius's singular command, and the strategy of caution resumed for the remainder of that year. Because of Fabius's avoidance of direct engagement, Hannibal did not win any more major battles in 217 BC after Trasimene. However, he was still roaming through Italy. By this time, Hannibal's army had been in the field for well over a year in enemy territory. He needed supplies and reinforcements. His requests to Carthage for more support were largely unanswered or insufficient. Carthage's leadership was divided and perhaps content with the victories already achieved, or simply unable to send large reinforcements because Rome controlled the sea routes. Hannibal thus had to rely on what he could procure in Italy and the allies he could persuade to join him. During these months, Hannibal also took measures to protect himself against other threats. The Romans, frustrated by their inability to defeat him in battle, might have tried clandestine ways to eliminate him. Some sources mention that Hannibal changed sleeping locations frequently and even used disguises such as different wigs and clothing so that spies would not easily identify him in his camp. Whether these specific anecdotes are true or embellished, they reflect the respect and fear Hannibal commanded. He was a constant thorn in Rome's side, and they were desperate to get rid of him by any means. As winter of 217 BC approached, both armies prepared to settle into winter quarters. Hannibal had to find a region that could host his troops and provide food. He moved to Apulia region in southeast Italy where the climate was milder and provisions could be found. Fabius returned to Rome to relinquish his dictatorship, as his 6-month term was expiring and the immediate crisis seemed contained. The year of Fabius's strategy ended with mixed results. Hannibal was still undefeated on Italian soil, but Rome had avoided further catastrophes. Fabius had bought Rome precious time to rebuild its military strength and morale. However, many Romans remained unconvinced that this waiting game could actually win the war. They worried that prolonging the conflict would only allow Hannibal to strengthen his influence over Rome's allies in Italy. So, as 216 BC dawned, Rome once again decided to take the offensive. The Romans raised one of the largest armies they had ever put together, determined to crush Hannibal once and for all. They mobilized perhaps around 80,000 infantry and a sizable cavalry force as well, drawing on every reserve, including younger men, older veterans, and even some slaves who were promised freedom if they fought bravely. This massive force was placed under the command of the two new consuls for 216 BC, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. These two men had contrasting temperaments. Paulus was cautious and from a noble family, somewhat in the mold of Fabius. Varro, on the other hand, was more impetuous and represented the more aggressive faction in Rome. Because Roman consuls alternated command day by day, it was a bit of a gamble how they would coordinate against a general like Hannibal. Hannibal, for his part, spent the early months of 216 consolidating his hold on parts of southern Italy. He eventually positioned his army in the southern region of Apulia, near a small town called Cannae. Cannae was significant because it housed a large Roman supply depot with grain and other provisions. Hannibal captured this supply depot, denying those resources to the Romans and choosing the site as a place to draw the Roman army into battle. The terrain near Cannae was a broad plain, ideal for Hannibal's superior cavalry to operate, and it also limited the risk of surprise moves by the Romans. When the Roman megarmy approached, Hannibal watched their movements closely. This was the showdown he had anticipated. Despite being outnumbered, Hannibal's forces were perhaps half the size of the Roman army. He did not shy away. He trusted in his strategies and the experience of his core troops, many of whom had been with him since the start of the war and through all the prior battles. The stage was set for a fateful confrontation in the summer of 216 BC. The Romans were confident that with such overwhelming numbers, they would finally trap and destroy Hannibal. Meanwhile, Hannibal prepared one of the most brilliant battle plans in history. The events that would unfold at Cannae would forever be remembered as the pinnacle of Hannibal's success, his greatest victory, which we will now recount gently, step by step. In the high summer heat of August 216 BC, the The two armies faced each other on the plain near Cannae. The Roman force, enormous in size, formed up with a confidence born of their superior numbers. Under the joint command of consuls Paulus and Varro, they arranged their troops in a deep formation, hoping to use their weight of numbers to smash through Hannibal's line. The dusty plain stretched out under the sun, and as the morning advanced, a light breeze began blowing from behind Hannibal's troops toward the Romans, carrying dust into Roman faces, a small detail that some say Hannibal took advantage of, positioning his army accordingly. Hannibal, on the other side, carefully deployed his more modest-sized army in a way that would turn the Romans' strengths against them. He placed his infantry in an interesting formation. At the center were his least reliable but still brave troops, a mix of Gallic warriors and Spanish infantry. Hannibal personally took position with these central forces. Instead of forming them in a straight line, he had them project slightly forward in a semicircular bulge toward the Romans. On the wings, set back a bit from the bulging center, he positioned his best infantry, the African heavy infantry. These Africans were battle-hardened and equipped with weapons largely taken from previous battles. They used Roman-style equipment captured at Trebia and Trasimene. They acted as the anchors of his infantry line, one group on the left and one on the right, held in a kind of reserve stance. Hannibal's cavalry he split as well. On his right facing the Roman left he placed his heavy cavalry, mostly commanded by a trusted officer often identified as Hasdrubal, one of his lieutenants, not to be confused with his brother of the same name. And on his left facing the Roman right he placed the nimble Numidian light cavalry under another officer Maharbal, one of his ablest commanders. Once all were in place, one can imagine a brief stillness as both sides steeled themselves. Then, the battle commenced, likely with horns blaring and shouts echoing across the field. The Roman infantry, on Varro's command as it was his day to lead, surged forward in a massive, dense formation aimed straight at the center of Hannibal's line, where they saw the enemy's troops positioned forward. Hannibal's Gallic and Spanish troops in the center met this charge and fought fiercely, but according to plan, they gradually started to give ground. Hannibal had instructed them to yield deliberately and step back in controlled fashion, ensuring they didn't break ranks entirely, but slowly letting the Romans push them. To the Romans, it appeared they were achieving exactly what they wanted. They were driving into the Carthaginian center, which was seemingly collapsing under pressure. With every foot the Romans advanced, their giant formation pushed further into what became a pocket, as the Carthaginian center pulled back more and more, now forming a concave shape. The dust from the dry plain swirled around the struggling soldiers. Hannibal's men in the center were certainly strained by the pressure of so many Romans, yet they did not rout. They kept up the fighting retreat with discipline. Hannibal and his brother Mago, who was likely among the central forces, rode along the line shouting encouragement, keeping their men cohesive even as they moved rearward. Meanwhile, the critical actions were unfolding on the flanks. On the Carthaginian right wing, the heavy cavalry of Hannibal charged at the Roman cavalry opposite them. The Roman cavalry on that flank was likely outnumbered or outclassed. They were not as strong as Hannibal's combination of well-trained Iberian and Gallic horsemen. The clash of horsemen was intense but short-lived. Hannibal's cavalry quickly overpowered the Roman cavalry on that side, scattering them from the field. Rather than pursue the fleeing Roman horse too far, the Carthaginian heavy cavalry regrouped and then rode behind the Roman army to assist the other wing. On Hannibal's left wing, the Numidian cavalry had been engaging the Roman allied cavalry. The Numidians fought in a fluid style, riding light and using javelins, harassing and confusing the enemy rather than meeting head-on. They skillfully kept the Roman allied horse occupied. Soon, the Carthaginian heavy cavalry that had triumphed on the other side swept in from behind and smashed into the second Roman cavalry force. Caught in a pincer between the Numidians and the heavy cavalry, the remaining Roman-aligned cavalry was utterly broken. Many were slain or ridden down, and others fled the field. With both flanks of Roman cavalry now gone, Hannibal's cavalry commanders, including the relentless Maharbal, did not waste any time. They rallied their riders and then turned their attention to the rear of the huge Roman infantry mass, which was still pressing forward against Hannibal's center. Perhaps at this moment, The Roman infantry was feeling confident, having pushed deep into the enemy center, which continued to yield. Many of these Romans were likely unaware that their cavalry had been defeated and that any threat could now come from behind them. At the crucial moment, Hannibal gave a signal. His African infantry, positioned until now relatively idle on the wings, swung into action. They advanced inward from both sides onto the flanks of the overextended Roman infantry blob. Suddenly, the Roman legions found themselves attacked on the left and right by fresh, elite African troops. The momentum of the Roman attack stalled. In an instant, the hunters became the trapped. Panic and confusion likely rippled through the Roman lines as they realized they were being surrounded. Finally, the Carthaginian cavalry charged into the fray from the rear, sealing the trap completely. The Roman army was now encircled on all sides, front, flanks, and rear. What had been an orderly advance now turned into a desperate fight for survival for the Romans. The tightly packed nature of their own formation became a terrible disadvantage. The soldiers were so crowded that they could scarcely use their weapons effectively, nor could they maneuver to face the attacks coming from all around. They were immobilized in a human mass. The Carthaginians formed a ring around this mass and methodically began to destroy the Roman army. The fighting, once the trap closed, likely turned into more of a slaughter than a contest. It is said that the battle lasted for hours as the Carthaginians systematically pressed inwards, cutting down Romans who could scarcely defend themselves. Exhaustion, heat, and fear set in among the trapped legionaries. The sheer scale of the killing was unprecedented. Ancient sources claim that on that day the Roman army lost tens of thousands of men. Modern estimates suggest that out of roughly 80,000 Roman and allied troops, as many as 50,000 to 60,000 were killed on the battlefield of Cannae. Another large portion were taken prisoner. Only perhaps 10,000 or so managed to escape, and that largely owed to the fact that as the circle tightened, some few broke out through the weakest point, or were not fully surrounded at the end and slipped away. Among the survivors was Consul Varro himself, who rode away from the disaster with a small band. Consul Paulus, the other commander, however, fought bravely and met his end on the field, choosing to die with his men rather than flee. When the grim work was done, Hannibal stood victorious amid one of the most catastrophic defeats the Roman Republic would ever suffer. Hannibal walked the field of Cannae, witnessing the outcome of his strategy. He had accomplished what no one in Rome thought possible. Another massive Roman army had been annihilated. In terms of loss of life, Cannae was unparalleled. The Roman dead included not just soldiers but many high-ranking officers, senators, and nobles, a devastating blow to Rome's military leadership class. Despite this total victory, Hannibal now faced a critical decision. Should he march on Rome itself? Many of his officers, intoxicated by the victory, urged him to do so. Maharbal, his cavalry commander, famously said something along the lines of, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it." In frustration that Hannibal did not immediately march on the capital. Hannibal, ever cautious even amid boldness, assessed the situation calmly. His army, though triumphant, was also exhausted. They had lost several thousand men in the hard-fought battle. Estimates of Carthaginian losses at Cannae range around 5,000 to 8,000, mostly from his Gallic but battered Gallic troops in the center. Importantly, Hannibal lacked heavy siege equipment necessary to assault the city of Rome's formidable walls. The Roman capital was still many miles away, and even with their armies defeated, the city could muster fresh defenders, including survivors of earlier battles and new levies. A direct attack on Rome might turn a sure victory into a potential failure. Hannibal ultimately decided not to immediately march on Rome. Instead, he elected to consolidate his new gains and try a different approach to force Roman surrender. In the days following Cannae, Hannibal released some of the allied Italian prisoners without ransom as a gesture, trying to win over Italian communities. For the Roman prisoners, there were thousands. He offered to ransom them back to Rome at a fair price. This was partly an attempt to initiate peace negotiations. However, when Hannibal's envoys went to the Roman Senate with a ransom offer, they were met with a grim resolve. The Roman Senate refused even to meet formally with the Carthaginian emissaries. They would not pay ransom for the prisoners. In fact, they passed a decree forbidding public mourning for the dead of Cannae to steal the city's spine. Rome, reeling but unbowed, signaled it would not make peace, no matter how grievous the defeat. This steely reaction might have surprised Hannibal. He had delivered what should have been a knockout blow, yet Rome was refusing to concede defeat. Meanwhile, the strategic situation in Italy did shift after Cannae. The impact on many of Rome's allies was significant. Seeing Rome's might so thoroughly shattered, a number of the southern Italian cities and peoples decided to break from Rome and side with Hannibal. The most notable was the city of Capua, a wealthy and influential city, which threw open its gates to Hannibal and welcomed him. Capua hoped to become the leading city in Italy if Rome's power waned. Hannibal made Capua something of a secondary base. Other regions in the south, including parts of Samnium, Lucania, Bruttium, the toe of Italy, and some of the Greek cities in the south, also aligned with Hannibal, at least for a time. Even the king of Macedon Philip V, across the sea in Greece, formed an alliance with Hannibal upon hearing of Cannae, though his actual help was minimal due to Roman opposition elsewhere. However, not everyone defected. In central Italy and the Latin heartland, many communities remained loyal to Rome, either out of steadfast loyalty or fear of Roman retribution if Hannibal were eventually defeated. Importantly, a lot of Rome's allies in the north and those who were granted Roman citizenship rights did not waver. The core of the Roman Republic remained intact. Hannibal now controlled a large swath of southern Italy, but Rome still held the center and north, and, of course, the city of Rome itself was unwavering. The war entered a new phase. After Cannae, Hannibal tried to capitalize on his victory by encouraging revolt among Rome's allies and by applying pressure on Rome through other means, short of directly storming the city. The Romans, for their part, responded to the catastrophe at Cannae with a grim, almost stoic determination. They levied yet more troops, even taking a drastic step of enlisting slaves and debtors into the army with promises of freedom, and raising the age limits to pull in older men, demonstrating how desperately they were scraping for manpower. The surviving consul Varro was not punished or shamed. In fact, the Senate thanked him for not losing hope in the Republic, as if to reinforce unity and show that Rome blamed not one man for the defeat, but accepted it as a collective tragedy to be overcome. The Romans also began to adapt more to Hannibal's methods. They avoided set-piece large battles with him for a long time after Cannae. Instead, they reverted to something akin to Fabius's strategy, harassing Hannibal's allies, slowly recapturing territory, and securing other fronts of the war, for the conflict had now spread beyond Italy as well. Cannae, in a sense, was the zenith of Hannibal's campaign, his greatest victory that created the greatest peril for Rome. Yet, from the Roman perspective, it was also the darkest before the dawn, a low point from which they astonishingly recovered. For Hannibal, though he continued to win battles for years after, he would never again have such a perfect opportunity to force Rome's submission. The war would continue, shifting into a slow grind, testing the endurance of both Hannibal and the Roman Republic. As our story continues, we will see how Hannibal's fortunes gradually begin to turn, illustrating that even the mightiest triumph can be followed by unforeseen challenges. After the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal enjoyed a period of supremacy in southern Italy. It might have seemed to an observer at the time that Rome's days were numbered. Hannibal certainly hoped that the shock of Cannae would encourage many more of Rome's allies to abandon Rome and join his side, forcing Rome to negotiate peace. As mentioned, some important cities did come over to him, Capua being the most prominent. Hannibal made Capua his winter quarters and treated the city's population and aristocracy with respect. There's an old story that Hannibal's soldiers, having spent the winter in the comfortable and luxury-loving environment of Capua, became soft Capuan luxury, as Roman writers would later sneer. This is likely exaggerated propaganda. Still, it's true that the ease of Capua was a change from the hardships of campaigning, and keeping his army disciplined and ready after such a long time in the field was one of Hannibal's continuous challenges. Despite Hannibal's control over much of the south, the Romans refused to give in. Under the surface, Rome was adapting and regrouping. They raised new legions using every available resource. They also reformed some tactics. direct confrontations with Hannibal were avoided. Instead, Roman armies under competent generals like Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who earned the nickname the Sword of Rome, engaged Hannibal in a series of smaller-scale actions and sieges. Marcellus managed to win a minor victory against Hannibal's forces at Nola and foiled Hannibal's attempts to capture the city. This showed that Hannibal's troops, while still dangerous, were not invincible when Romans fought with caution and better planning. One by one, Rome started taking back the initiative. In 212 BC, Hannibal scored a significant success by capturing the city of Tarentum in a cunning night operation with the help of inside sympathizers. However, even that achievement was limited. The Roman garrison held Tarentum's citadel, the fortified part of the city, and with naval resupply, they kept a toehold there. Meanwhile, in the same year, a blow struck Hannibal's cause elsewhere. The Romans managed to eliminate one of his key allies in Sicily. The city of Syracuse in Sicily had allied with Hannibal after Cannae, but Roman forces under Marcellus besieged and captured Syracuse in 212 BC, famously leading to the death of the inventor Archimedes. With Syracuse's fall, Carthage lost influence in Sicily, and Rome secured that important island back under its control, thereby protecting its southern flank and gaining a base to potentially threaten Carthage directly in the future. In Italy, the Romans also concentrated on isolating Hannibal. They recaptured towns that had defected whenever possible and punished them severely as a warning to others. The most significant Roman riposte came in 211 BC. That year, a large Roman force laid siege to Capua to reclaim it from Hannibal's new allies. Hannibal, unwilling to lose his greatest Italian ally without a fight, marched to relieve Capua. However, multiple Roman armies coordinated to block him. Unable to break the siege by direct assault, Hannibal tried a bold stratagem. He marched north toward Rome itself, hoping that the threat to the city would compel the Romans to lift the siege of Capua and rush to defend their capital. Indeed, Hannibal got close to Rome's walls, so close that, as legend has it, he could see the city in the distance and even rode up to the Colline Gate of Rome. There was panic in Rome, but the Romans did not recall their legions from Capua. They correctly guessed that Hannibal lacked the siege equipment for a true attack on the city and was attempting a diversion. Thus, Hannibal's demonstration at the walls of Rome, while dramatic and giving rise to the fearful cry "Hannibal ad portas," Hannibal is at the gates, among the populace, did not achieve its objective. The Senate stayed calm. One anecdote later recounted how a piece of land outside Rome that Hannibal was camped on was actually put up for sale by a Roman, and it found a buyer at normal price. This story, true or not, symbolized Roman confidence and defiance, even with Hannibal at their doorstep. Unable to draw off the legions from Capua, Hannibal eventually had to march back south. Shortly after, Capua fell to the Romans. The Romans punished the city harshly. Its leading citizens were executed or exiled. This served as a stark message to any wavering allies. Rome would eventually come back, and betraying Rome would be costly. Losing Capua was a serious setback for Hannibal. It indicated that his grip on his Italian conquests was weakening. One by one, the pieces of Italy that had joined him were being retaken by Rome. Hannibal himself continued to show his tactical brilliance on the battlefield whenever circumstances allowed. There were still smaller battles and skirmishes where Hannibal outmaneuvered Roman forces sent against him, preventing them from an outright victory over him. But he was increasingly being contained to the southern part of the Italian peninsula, notably the region of Bruttium, the toe of Italy. He made the town of Croton in Bruttium a base in his later years in Italy. Meanwhile, beyond Italy, the wider war was tilting in Rome's favor. In Spain, since 218 BC, Hannibal's brothers Hasdrubal Barca and another brother, Mago, along with other Carthaginian generals, were engaged in a back-and-forth struggle with Roman forces. Hannibal's departure from Spain had left Carthaginian holdings there in a vulnerable state, contested by the Romans who were eager to cut off Hannibal's support and perhaps even open a path to invade Carthage from Spain. The Romans initially sent forces under Gnaeus and Publius Scipio, a pair of brothers, the elder of whom was the father of the future Scipio Africanus, to Spain. The Scipio brothers did well for a time, winning battles and encouraging local Celtiberian tribes to ally with Rome. However, in 211 BC, the Carthaginians in Spain, led by Hasdrubal and Mago, managed to defeat and kill both Scipio brothers in battle. That was a rare bright spot for Carthage, and it momentarily threatened to undo Roman gains in Spain. Yet Rome did not give up on Spain. In 210 BC, they appointed a young and ambitious commander to take charge there, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the 25-year-old son of the fallen general. Scipio arrived in Spain and proved to be a prodigious talent. In 209 BC, he led a daring assault on New Carthage, Cartagena, the main Carthaginian stronghold on the Spanish east coast. By attacking swiftly and unexpectedly, he captured the city, gaining a treasure trove of supplies and hostages, and severely weakening Carthaginian control in Spain. Over the next few years, Scipio continued to win over local tribes and win battles. In 208 BC, he faced Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal Barca at the Battle of Becula. Scipio won that engagement, though Hasdrubal managed to slip away with a portion of his army. Realizing that Spain was largely lost and hoping to help his brother in Italy, Hasdrubal Barca decided to emulate Hannibal's epic march. In 207 BC, Hasdrubal led a force through Gaul and crossed the Alps into Italy, just as Hannibal had done 11 years earlier. This was a critical moment. If Hasdrubal could unite with Hannibal in Italy, the two brothers together might reignite Carthaginian fortunes there. Hannibal, upon learning of Hasdrubal's approach, began moving north from Bruttium to meet him. The Romans, however, were determined to prevent this junction of forces. The consuls for 207 BC, Marcus Livius and Gaius Claudius Nero, devised a plan. Nero took a picked force of his best troops and made a rapid, stealthy march northward from the southern front where he had been shadowing Hannibal. He joined up with Livius's army in the north, giving the Romans a combined strength sufficient to face Hasdrubal. The two consuls caught Hasdrubal near the Medeiurus River in central Italy. In the ensuing Battle of the Medeiurus, Hasdrubal's army was overwhelmed and destroyed. Hasdrubal himself died in the fight. Accounts say he fought bravely to the end, and when he saw the battle was lost, he charged into the enemy and was killed. Others say he was slain trying to escape. The victory at Medeiurus in 207 BC was a major turning point. It eliminated the chance of Hannibal being reinforced by a second Carthaginian army. When Nero hurried back south to confront Hannibal again, he carried with him a grim token of the battle, Hasdrubal's severed head. Upon returning to the area near Hannibal's camp, Nero had Hasdrubal's head thrown towards Hannibal's outposts. It landed, letting Hannibal know in the most visceral way that his brother was dead and his hope of a junction had failed. There's an often cited story that when Hannibal saw this, he remarked sadly that he recognized the doom of Carthage, basically acknowledging that Rome was gaining the upper hand. From this point on, Hannibal's campaign in Italy was largely a holding action. He had lost two of his brothers. The third brother, Mago, was still in Iberia or moving toward Italy by sea. Carthage's influence in Spain was crumbling steadily under Scipio's aggressive campaign. Indeed, by 206 BC, Scipio had virtually cleared Spain of Carthaginian forces after a decisive win at the Battle of Ilipa, which left Carthage with no significant army in that theater. Hannibal's last remaining brother, Mago, attempted to continue the fight by leaving Spain and sailing to northern Italy in 205 BC with a small force to incite the Gauls there and perhaps draw Roman attention. Mago established a toehold in Liguria, northwest Italy, and fought some battles with the Romans. But he too was unable to turn the tide. He was wounded in battle and would eventually withdraw, only to die of his wounds on the journey back. Around 203 BC, back in Africa, Carthage itself had largely been safe from direct attack so far. But with Spain lost and Hannibal stalled in Italy, Rome began to consider a knockout blow, an invasion of Carthage's home territory. In 205 BC, the rising star Scipio, who had returned to Rome to a hero's welcome from his victories in Spain, was elected consul. Scipio was eager to carry the war to Africa. After some debate, since some conservative Romans felt Hannibal should be defeated in Italy first, rather than risking a foreign expedition, Scipio got permission to prepare an invasion force. By 204 BC, Scipio had assembled an army in Sicily, trained it rigorously, even incorporating some volunteers who were survivors of Cannae, giving them a chance to redeem themselves, and then crossed over to North Africa. The arrival of Scipio's forces in Africa opened a new chapter of the war. Suddenly Carthage itself was under threat, and the Carthaginian leadership recalled some of their focus from Italy to their own defense. In 204–203 BC, Scipio, with the aid of local allies like King Maximus of the Numidians, formerly an ally of Carthage who switched sides to Rome, won a series of engagements in Africa. One of Scipio's key victories was the Battle of the Great Plains near Utica in 203 BC, where a Carthaginian army was defeated and one of Carthage's top commanders, Hasdrubal, was routed alongside his Numidian ally Syphax. This put Carthage in a dire position. The Carthaginian Senate, now feeling the real danger to their city, decided it was time to bring their champion back. They sent orders for Hannibal to return from Italy to defend the homeland. Thus, after 15 years of waging war on Italian soil, Hannibal Barca received the summons to come back to Africa. It must have been a moment of mixed emotions for him. Italy had been the arena of his greatest triumphs and also many hardships. He had roamed up and down the peninsula, nearly to Rome's gates and back to the tip of the boot. Now, in late 203 BC, he prepared to leave it, essentially conceding that his campaign there had reached its end without delivering a final victory. Hannibal gathered the remaining loyal troops he had, still a considerable number, including that core of veterans who had crossed the Alps with him and survived all the battles since. He also recruited as many Italic allies from the south as were willing to follow him. Before departing, there's an account that Hannibal visited the temple of Juno Licinia in Croton and there dedicated inscriptions recounting his deeds. It was as if he was leaving a record behind in Italy of what he had achieved, perhaps knowing the significance of what he had done, even though final success had eluded him. In the spring of 202 BC, Hannibal set sail from Italy back to North Africa. For the first time since he was a boy, Hannibal was returning to his homeland not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a defender of a homeland under siege. The stage was now set for the final confrontation between Rome and Carthage in this war, a confrontation that would pit Hannibal against the young Roman general Scipio, two brilliant minds who had studied each other from afar and now would finally meet on the battlefield in Hannibal's own country. Upon arriving in Africa, Hannibal took some time to reorganize and reinforce his army for the defense of Carthage. He enlisted additional soldiers, both new recruits from among the Carthaginians and the locals, and mercenaries, and even some veteran troops who were part of other Carthaginian forces. One notable addition to his ranks was a contingent of war elephants, around 80 of these formidable beasts, which Carthage had prepared for its last stand. Hannibal had not commanded elephants since the early battles in Italy, and now he once again had a significant number under his control. Meanwhile, the Roman general Scipio had been ravaging the countryside of Carthage and stripping away Carthaginian allies. Maximus's Numidian cavalry, now fighting for Rome, gave Scipio a crucial edge in mounted forces. Before the final battle was fought, there was an effort at diplomacy. Hannibal and Scipio actually met face to face in a parley, perhaps near the town of Zama. By now Hannibal was in his mid-40s and Scipio in his early 30s. The two had great respect for each other. They discussed potential peace terms. Hannibal may have been frank that Carthage would relinquish claims over Spain and other conquests if only Rome would cease hostilities, but the time for negotiation had likely passed. Rome's Senate wanted a total victory and an unconditional surrender, especially after the long and bitter war. The meeting ended without an agreement. It is moving to imagine the scene. Hannibal, who had come so close to defeating Rome, speaking courteously with the general who had learned from his tactics and turned the tide. But destiny still required that they settle the war by arms. Not long after, The two armies drew up for battle on the plains near Zama, which was not far from Carthage itself, in what is now northern Tunisia. Hannibal arranged his forces in multiple lines. In the front, he placed his war elephants, intended to smash through Roman ranks. Behind them, he deployed his infantry in three ranks. The first rank made up of mixed troops, including foreign mercenaries and some Carthaginian infantry. The second rank composed of Carthaginian citizen soldiers and some of the surviving soldiers from other African forces. And the last rank held his most reliable men, the veterans who had fought with him in Italy, hardened by years of campaigning. Hannibal positioned himself with these veterans at the rear, aiming to use them as the deciding force when the initial clash had weakened the enemy. On the wings, he placed his cavalry, but he had fewer horsemen than he would have liked, and they were outmatched by the combination of Roman cavalry and Maximus's numerous Numidian horsemen supporting Scipio. Scipio, for his part, had studied reports of Hannibal's use of elephants in earlier battles. He devised a formation to deal with them. Rather than a solid continuous line, Scipio arranged his legions with wide lanes or gaps between certain units. These gaps were intentionally left so that when the elephants charged, they could be channeled down these open corridors, where they could be showered with javelins and frightened off, or at least isolated rather than allowed to smash directly into tightly packed Roman ranks. He also placed skirmishers, light troops with javelins and perhaps trumpets or noisemakers at the front to disrupt the elephants. The Roman heavy infantry stood in manipular formations behind, ready to engage whatever came through. Scipio's cavalry, including Maximus's, he placed on the flanks to engage Hannibal's mounted troops. The battle began with the dramatic charge of Carthage's war elephants. At Hannibal's behest, these great beasts, with their tusks perhaps tipped with iron and carrying howdahs of javelin throwers on their backs, lumbered and trumpeted towards the Roman lines. It must have been an intimidating sight. Many Roman soldiers had never faced elephants, yet Scipio's preparations paid off. Roman trumpeters blew loud and discordant blasts. Skirmishers hurled darts. Some elephants, frightened and confused, veered away or turned back into their own lines. Others did charge into the lanes left by Scipio. As planned, they found no dense formation to trample but instead were goaded down these corridors until they could be dispatched or driven further to the rear. A few elephants did cause chaos. One or two slammed into Roman units, and others rampaged back through Hannibal's left cavalry, disrupting it badly. The overall elephant attack, however, failed to break the Roman army. It was largely neutralized. Next, the cavalry on both sides clashed. On Hannibal's right wing, his outnumbered cavalry engaged the combined Roman and Italian horse facing them, while on his left wing, his Numidian allies met Maximus's larger contingent of Numidian loyal to Rome. Very quickly, Carthage's mounted troops were overwhelmed. The Roman/Italian cavalry drove Hannibal's right-wing cavalry from the field, and Maximus's horsemen did the same on the other flank. The Carthaginian cavalry did not hold. Most were chased away from the battlefield, with Roman and Maximus's riders in hot pursuit. This meant that unlike previous battles like Cannae, now the Romans had the advantage of cavalry, and Hannibal's army was left with no mounted support on the field itself. With the elephants dealt with and the cavalry fight moving off the field, the main bodies of infantry now came to blows. Scipio's legions advanced steadily. They first met Hannibal's front line, composed of the mercenaries and mixed troops. A fierce fight ensued. Hannibal's first-line soldiers fought hard, but as the Romans pressed on, this front line began to waver. Under pressure, they eventually fell back onto the second line of Carthaginian citizen troops. At this juncture, there was disorder in the Carthaginian ranks. The retreating mercenaries were frustrated, possibly feeling that the Carthaginian second line had not supported them enough, and the second line was disorganized by the sudden influx of fleeing soldiers in among them. Some ancient accounts suggest that infighting broke out between the mercenaries and the Carthaginian soldiers at this point, though it might simply be that the cohesion of Hannibal's first two lines was now broken. Seeing this, Scipio kept the momentum. The Romans pushed through the combined mass of the first and second Carthaginian lines, which eventually collapsed or scattered under the Roman assault. Many of those Carthaginian and mercenary soldiers then fled the field, some perhaps back toward Carthage, and others were cut down as they ran. Now came the final and most intense phase of the battle. Hannibal had so far held his third line, his veteran reserves, out of the fight. These were his best troops, the seasoned fighters from Italy, and they were still fresh and in formation. As the Romans approached, Hannibal's veteran infantry likely formed a solid line and prepared to face the Roman legions head-on. Here were the two finest infantries of the ancient world meeting. Rome's disciplined legions against Hannibal's battle-hardened warriors who had known nothing but victory for many years. What followed was a bloody, evenly matched contest. Both sides fought with desperate courage, knowing the war's outcome hung in the balance. Hannibal's veterans held their ground firmly, and the Romans, initially perhaps tired from having fought through two previous lines, could not easily break them. Scipio even had to adjust his tactics at this point, perhaps ordering part of his forces to spread out and attempt to envelop Hannibal's line, trying to recreate a bit of the double envelope tactic on a small scale. The struggle swayed back and forth, neither side giving quarter. The decisive blow, however, was about to land from the outside. By now, the Roman and Numidian cavalry that had chased off the Carthaginian horse earlier were returning to the battlefield. Having pursued the fleeing Carthaginian cavalry far enough, they looped back. In a mirror of Hannibal's own great tactics, Scipio's cavalry now charged into the rear of Hannibal's engaged infantry. This was the breaking point. Attacked from the front by the Roman legions and suddenly from behind by cavalry, Hannibal's valiant third line was trapped. They began to falter and collapse in on themselves. Surrounded and with no hope, many Carthaginian soldiers started to surrender or were cut down where they stood. Hannibal realized the battle was lost. He managed to escape the field, likely protected by some of his loyal men. A great number of his soldiers lay dead or were captured in the aftermath. Zama was a complete Roman victory. Scipio had done what no Roman before him could. He defeated Hannibal in a set-piece battle. The Second Punic War effectively ended with the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Carthage, with its main army now gone and its great general beaten, had no choice but to sue for peace. Hannibal, ever the realist, did not advise any futile last stands. Instead, he advocated for peace to save the city. The terms dictated by Rome were severe, yet not so severe as to erase Carthage entirely. Rome at this point sought to neutralize rather than destroy Carthage. Carthage had to surrender its fleet, almost all of its warships, all its elephants, and a large portion of its territory. They could keep their city and core African lands but lost all overseas territories including Spain, which now forever would belong to Rome. Carthage was also bound by a heavy indemnity payment to Rome for 50 years and was forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission. When the peace treaty was concluded, Scipio's successes earned him the agnomen honorary surname Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. As for Hannibal, he was now a general without a war. Nevertheless, he remained a key figure in Carthage's society. The years immediately after the war saw an interesting turn in Hannibal's life. Instead of being treated as a scapegoat for losing as might happen in some societies, Hannibal was hailed still as a patriot and a hero by the Carthaginian public. His earlier victories and the mere fact that Carthage had survived at all under the shadow of Rome's wrath gave him considerable clout. In 196 BC, just a few years after Zama, Hannibal was elected to the highest office of Carthage, that of Suffete, essentially chief magistrate, similar to a head of state in the Carthaginian Republic. He took to governance with the same energy he had taken to war. Hannibal implemented important reforms in Carthage. Carthage had been run by an oligarchic council of nobles, and some corruption had seeped into the management of public funds. Hannibal cracked down on that corruption and restructured the city's finances. One major achievement was that under his guidance, Carthage began paying off the war indemnity to Rome much faster than required, through efficient financial administration and perhaps increased trade revenue. This swift economic recovery and payment schedule not only eased the burden on Carthaginian citizens but also had a side effect. It worried some members of the Carthaginian elite who lost some ill-gotten gains to his anti-corruption measures, and it made some Romans uneasy to see Carthage bouncing back so quickly. Hannibal's internal enemies in Carthage began to plot against him. resenting his reforms and perhaps fearful of his popularity among the people. These disgruntled aristocrats found willing ears in Rome. Some Roman senators, like the elder Cato the censor, famous for later saying Carthage must be destroyed, harbored deep distrust toward Carthage and towards Hannibal personally, viewing him as a lingering threat. They suspected that if Hannibal remained influential, he might incite a new war or find new allies to challenge Rome again. Soon, Roman envoys arrived in Carthage, ostensibly on unrelated diplomatic business but very much interested in Hannibal's activities. These envoys, prodded by Hannibal's Carthaginian opponents, accused him of conspiring with Antiochus Roman III, the Hellenistic Greek king of the Seleucid Empire, who at that time was at odds with Rome. Whether Hannibal was truly corresponding with Antiochus with warlike intentions is uncertain, though indeed later Hannibal would join Antiochus, possibly indicating he had opened channels. In any case, it became clear to Hannibal that Rome was creating pressure for Carthage to surrender him, or at least remove him from power, rather than risk causing Carthage further trouble or falling into the hands of his enemies. Hannibal decided to go voluntarily into exile. In a quiet departure around 195 BC, under the cover of night, Hannibal left Carthage. One imagines this was bittersweet. He had spent his life fighting for his homeland and now had to leave it to protect it. The people of Carthage were said to be sorrowful at his exit, understanding the reasons. Hannibal sailed across the sea to the east, beginning the last chapter of his life as a wanderer in foreign courts. He first traveled to Tyre, the old Phoenician city that was the mother city of Carthage. There, he was welcomed with honor. Tyre regarded him as a kind of national hero due to their shared heritage. But Hannibal didn't stay there long. His ultimate destination was the court of King Antiochus Roman III of the Seleucid Empire based in Syria. Antiochus was a powerful ruler who was currently in a cold war, soon to be a hot war with Rome over influence in Greece and Asia Minor. Hearing of Hannibal's availability, Antiochus gladly received him. Hannibal became an advisor in the Seleucid court. One might think Antiochus would immediately put Hannibal in charge of all his forces, given the Carthaginians' renown. But politics in a king's court are seldom so straightforward. Antiochus valued Hannibal's counsel but also perhaps was wary of him. This famous foreign general, who might overshadow the king's own commanders or attract too much fame. Nevertheless, when war between Antiochus and Rome did break out, the Roman-Seleucid War of 192–189 BC, Hannibal's expertise was utilized. He was given a naval command at one point. A famous anecdote from this period: in a naval battle against the fleet of the kingdom of Pergamon, an ally of Rome, Hannibal resorted to a clever trick. Knowing his inexperienced sailors might not match the enemy in a conventional fight, he ordered pots filled with venomous snakes to be catapulted onto the decks of the enemy ships. At first, the Pergamene sailors were perplexed by these clay pots smashing on their decks, until angry snakes slithered out and around their feet. The sudden chaos and terror among the enemy crew helped Hannibal win that engagement at sea. It was a small victory, but it showed he had not lost his inventive touch. However, the larger war did not go in Antiochus's favor. The Seleucid king was decisively defeated by Roman forces led by Scipio's brother Lucius Cornelius Scipio, with Scipio Africanus himself advising at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. In the subsequent peace treaty of 188 BC, Rome imposed terms on Antiochus which, among other things, likely included handing over notable enemies of Rome. Hannibal's presence in Antiochus's court had been no secret, and certainly the Romans demanded he be surrendered. Hannibal, anticipating that his welcome might soon wear thin with Antiochus under Roman pressure, fled yet again. He went further north, seeking refuge at the court of King Prusias I of Bithynia, a small kingdom in what is now northwest Turkey. Prusias was engaged in a local conflict with Rome's ally, King Eumenes Roman II of Pergamon, the same Pergamon that Hannibal had battled at sea. Prusias happily received Hannibal and availed himself of the old general's strategic mind in his war against Pergamon. It was during this time, presumably in his early 60s, that Hannibal fought his last military actions, such as the snake jars stratagem mentioned earlier. If it hadn't happened before, Though Prusias won some victories with Hannibal's help, he too eventually came to terms with Rome. By around 183 BC, Rome's patience had run out. They dispatched envoys, led by the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus, directly to Bithynia to demand Hannibal's surrender. Prusias, intimidated by Rome's might, acquiesced and agreed to give up Hannibal. Soldiers were sent to surround Hannibal's residence, a countryside estate or perhaps a small castle where he stayed. The legend goes that Hannibal, upon seeing that escape was impossible and that Roman soldiers were at his door, decided to take control of his fate one last time. He had long carried with him a small vial of poison, some say concealed in a ring. Now, cornered and unwilling to be paraded as a captive in Rome, Hannibal ingested the poison. As the poison took effect and he felt death approach, Hannibal spoke final words to those around him. According to one account, he said, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." In other words, he was wryly noting that Rome had feared him for so long that even now, decades after he first challenged them, they could not rest until he was gone, so he would oblige them by ending his own life. Thus died Hannibal Barca, around the age of 64, far from his homeland but still, in his last act, undefeated by his pursuers. The news of Hannibal's death resonated across the ancient world. In Rome, perhaps some breathed a sigh of relief. The specter that had haunted their childhoods, for Roman parents often used Hannibal's name to scare unruly children into obedience, whispering "Hannibal is at the gates," was finally gone. Scipio Africanus, upon hearing of Hannibal's end, is said to have felt no joy, but rather a solemn respect. These two great adversaries even reportedly met one last time years before, in the courts of the East after the war, and engaged in polite conversation about great generals of history. When Scipio asked Hannibal whom he thought the greatest general ever was, Hannibal named Alexander the Great first, Pius of Epirus second, and himself third, adding that if he had defeated Scipio, he would place himself even above Alexander. With Hannibal's passing, an era of epic rivalry ended. Carthage, deprived of its genius defender and constrained by peace terms, lived on commercially for a time, but eventually, about 35 years later, Rome would provoke the Third Punic War, besiege Carthage, and finally destroy the city in 146 BC, ending Carthage's existence as a power once and for all. One wonders if Hannibal, had he been alive then, could have averted that fate or at least given Rome pause once more. But by then, the Roman Republic was an unstoppable colossus, and the Mediterranean world was truly under its dominion. Hannibal's legacy, however, lived far beyond Carthage's fall. In the centuries that followed, even Roman historians, though Rome's enemies, wrote of Hannibal with a mixture of fear and admiration. They acknowledged his unmatched skill in generalship. His tactics at battles like Cannae became legendary, studied by military leaders for millennia to come. In fact, Cannae is still cited in military academies as a classic example of a perfect double envelopment maneuver. Generals throughout history have looked to Hannibal's campaigns for lessons. Even in modern times, his strategies are discussed when talking about military genius. One can say that Hannibal educated Rome in warfare even as he fought them. Rome's later armies became more flexible and tactically savvy, partly learning from the very man who had dealt them their worst defeats. The name Hannibal also took on a sort of mythic quality. Roman children, as noted, were told tales of his cunning as almost a bogeyman figure, yet also a model of a formidable foe. The phrase "Hannibal is at the gates" persisted as a proverb to evoke imminent danger and urgency. Beyond strategy and fearsome reputation, there's something profoundly human and even tragic in Hannibal's story. He dedicated his life to a cause set for him in childhood, to fight Rome. He came incredibly close to victory and in the end watched it slip away, due to factors beyond just battlefield prowess, the resilience of the Roman state, the lack of full support from his own government at critical moments, and the sheer attrition of time. Hannibal's life was a tale of rise and fall, triumph and disappointment. Yet through it all, he demonstrated unwavering resolve, cleverness, and a leadership that inspired loyalty in diverse peoples from Iberians to Gauls to Africans. As you've journeyed with me through this long story, from Hannibal's boyhood oath to the lonely exile's end, Perhaps you have sensed the ebb and flow of fortune that shapes human lives. The world Hannibal lived in was very different from ours, filled with monarchs, republics, and battles fought with sword and spear. But certain themes are universal: determination, pride, courage, and the eventual calm after the storm. Now, at last, the tale of Hannibal Barca draws to a close. The Mediterranean winds have scattered the echoes of battle cries. The Alps that once felt the tread of his elephants stand silent under the stars. Carthage and Rome have passed into history books, and Hannibal himself rests as a memory of a time long ago. But his story, gentle listener, has traveled through over 2,000 years to reach your ears tonight. In reflecting on Hannibal's life, we see a man who soared to great heights and faced profound lows, yet remained true to his purpose throughout, keeping the oath he swore as a boy, opposing Rome to his final day. It reminds us that even the most extraordinary lives are still mortal, bound by time and fate. In the end, Hannibal found peace in ending his struggle on his own terms, and the relentless conflict finally ceased. I invite you now to let this story settle softly in your mind. Feel the quiet after the battles, the peace that eventually came to a war-torn world. The rise and fall of Hannibal Barca is a tale for the ages, and now that age is long past, we are left with lessons and echoes, but also with a sense of tranquility that all storms, no matter how fierce, eventually subside. As you breathe gently in and out, imagine the gentle night sky over ancient Carthage once more, calm and eternal, indifferent to the clash of empires below. The sea that carried Hannibal's ships glistens under the moonlight, and the fires of war are gone, replaced by the soft glow of stars. It's time now to let go of the story and drift into your own peaceful rest. You've listened well and traveled far in time and space. Now there is nothing more to do, no more history to consider. Just allow yourself to sink into the comfort of your bed, knowing that you are safe and that the world outside is quiet. Good night and sweet dreams.